So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what you can do to prepare your manuscript to hopefully give it a good chance during the publication process, during the review process. I'm not going to dwell on how you write a manuscript. Hopefully many of you know this, or you all know that there are resources available within the library, within your own departments, who can provide that information. But I am going to dwell a little bit on some of the lessons I've observed being on the editorial side as well as on the publishing side. The first question you want to ask is, what type of manuscript do I have? There's usually three main research-focused or research-based types of article. There's a full-length article, which is a substantial, complete, and comprehensive piece of research. There's a letter or a short communication, sometimes called a brief report. These are smaller. They could be pilot studies, studies where you just don't have that many participants involved, and so you don't have as robust a data set to explore. And then the review papers. And there are a few reasons why it's good to know what kind of paper you're talking about. One is review papers tend to be invited by a lot of journals. So if you have a very good topic, if you have an idea and you've written it up and you send it in unsolicited, it's an easy way for a journal to say, I'm sorry, we only consider solicited reviews. So if you do have an exciting review, I encourage you to reach out to the editors beforehand, looking over editors to make sure they don't disagree. If you do have a topic that you think might be of interest to a journal, it's worth reaching out beforehand. I will say now, I'll refer a few times to contacting a journal. When I say this, I don't mean Google the editor and then look up their personal email address and send it to them. But look on the journal's homepage, see what they provide as the preferred method of communication. So the difference between a full article and a brief communication can also be important, because one of the things that reviewers will easily pick up on is if you're trying to take what's not really a very long paper or a very robust set of results and try to stretch it into 15, 20 pages. It makes it thin, it makes it weak, and it's going to get you criticized by the reviewers. Similarly, although this happens less often, if you try to take a really extensive, complicated set of results and condense them into 2 to 3 pages, something's going to get lost along the way. I'll also note here, I refer to them as letters, and this is an important thing to note, is that what journals call these, it can vary significantly. Brief reports is common. Letters to the editor is actually pretty common. And this is a question I get a lot. It's not really a letter. Why do we call it a letter? And I'll tell you that historically, this actually has some impact factor implications. A lot of the reason why journals call them letters to the editor has to do with the fact that they don't want them to be counted as what's called a source item by the impact factor calculators. Talk about this in a moment, but just in case you're curious. Oh, yes. Okay. So the process of writing the article. As I said, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but the important thing here is that much like as a reader, very rarely do we read from page 1 to page 10 anymore. Same thing's true of writing it. Right? You're thinking about building that article, starting with the data and then elaborating upon that. You've got the data, then you've got the more literal, the methods, results, the discussion. Then you start to get into that narrative portion that really sets an article apart, the conclusion, the introduction. And really only then should be turning to the title and the abstract. The title is one of the more important parts of the paper. It's the one that people encounter first. This includes all your readers. That's not just the people who are actually reading it after it's published, but this is your reviewers, your editor. It's the first thing that they're going to see. If you lose them with the title, you're going to have a hard time finding them again. But certainly from the readership aspect, if you're looking at a long list of search results and think about your own habits here, if that title doesn't immediately say to you, this is relevant to what I'm looking for, how likely are you to click on it to investigate? So that's why you have to think about your title carefully. You want to use the fewest possible words. To go back to the point I was making earlier about reading on different sized screens, you're dealing with truncation, you're dealing with things going so that you have to scroll, and people really don't like to scroll. You lose a lot of people if you fall beyond that first screen. So you're trying to use the fewest possible words. Keep it condensed, keep it sensible. You want to adequately describe the content. You're not hyping it, you're not making claims. And this is where sometimes it's tempting to use clever titles that maybe have puns in them, maybe have jokes in them. And I'm a huge fan of puns, so don't get me wrong, but you lose a lot of readers that way because they don't know what the article is actually about. And again, if you want them to click through, that's the ultimate goal here. Don't use uncommon abbreviations. As science becomes more and more interdisciplinary, the potential readers are going to be far broader, far wider than your immediate specialty, your immediate discipline. So think about, is this something that translates? Is this something that people who don't know me and don't know my immediate area of expertise would understand? Yes?
Do you recommend putting at least for clinical, do you recommend, at least for clinical research, putting in the type of study into the title itself, like randomized clinical trial or case control study, et cetera?
Great question. So he was asking if I recommend putting the type of study into the title itself. I would say that increasingly this is being more and more encouraged. Some editors have different feelings about it, often trying to trade off brevity versus descriptiveness. But I think that what we find is editors try to encourage it because they find readers really appreciate it. Is this a mouse study? Is this a human study? You can make things that much more effective for your readers before they click through. Is it a pilot? That's certainly helpful information to include so you know what to expect before you click through. Is it? Probably the most important part of your article is your abstract. And I say this because of the many, many people who will claim to have read your article, most of them will have only read your abstract. It's an advertisement for your article at all levels. When we send a manuscript out to review, the reviewers typically get the title, the abstract, maybe the list of authors. And as the vast majority of reviewers are volunteers who have many other commitments on their time, they need to decide, is this paper going to be worth my attention? Is it worth me putting in the hours it's going to take to review this? And one of the first ways they're going to determine that is based on your abstract.
So I was under the impression that most reviews were blinded, but you're saying they know the authors and the affiliations. Is that always the case?
We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to peer review, but what you're referring to is called double-blind review, which is not the default status in most fields. There are a number of journals that do it that way, but yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Thank you. So what do you want to do in your abstract? You want to make it interesting, you want to make it understandable, but at the same time you want to be accurate. And this is a huge one. I always include this study, which I really enjoyed, from BMJ a couple of years ago, where they looked at language use in abstracts between the 1970s and today. And they found that the number of words that could be described as positive increased substantially during that time. So an average of 2% of abstracts back in the 70s used words like robust, novel, innovative. When they looked at it in 2014, it was 17.5%, which, granted, science is accelerating, that's wonderful, but at the same time, do we really think that there are 50% more groundbreaking studies, 50% more unprecedented studies than there were back then? It's something that people are becoming increasingly immune to. I work with one editor who has disallowed the use of the word novel anywhere in the article because he says it's just too hard to prove. You're going to send it out for review and someone's going to say, wait a second, that's not novel, and ding you on it. So be mindful about this. Be accurate in reporting it. You do want to make it interesting, though. So think about the best presentation. I always encourage people to read the abstract aloud to someone who maybe doesn't know their research that well. See what questions they have. See what doesn't come out clearly. Another reason that the abstract is important is if you have an abstract that's riddled with typographical errors, with language mistakes, the assumption is going to be that that will carry over into your paper. If you can make that abstract as clean and clear and precise as possible, that's a good indicator of what to expect. Anything from the editors on that one? Okay. So references, tacked on at the end, often forgotten about. There's a few points here. You want to always ensure that you fully absorb the material that you're referencing. There are a few reasons for this. Probably the single largest rule is that if you have miscited or misquoted a particular study, there's a good chance that that person will end up reviewing your paper. And they will point it out. So just make sure that before you cite it, you have actually read it. If you're citing a review article, have you traced it back to the original research to the degree possible? Is that really what those authors said? You want to avoid excessive self-citation or excessive citations of publications from the same institution. A lot of editors do look at the references quite closely. And if you've got, say, 25 references, 23 of which are your group, this tells one of several things. Maybe you didn't do the necessary prep work that was required. Maybe this is a topic that is of absolutely no interest to anyone except you. So you want to think about carefully situating your work in the context of all the work that's come before it. Yes?
And also make sure the references are up to date. There's nothing that looks worse than all the references being from 2000 or earlier.
It's a very good point.
For those that don't know, I'd also recommend using a bibliographic manager such as EndNote, or I think there's another one, Bibliograph. There's several of them. And you can often actually search the style of the manuscript and it'll automatically format it. Some want 3 authors, some want 6 authors, some want the title underlined or italicized, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And that brings me to the last point here. If required, conform strictly to the style given instructions for authors, and this is a lot easier when you have one of those reference managers. There was a study a couple of years ago that we conducted that found that people were spending hours reformatting references, which is a fantastic waste of any researcher or physician's time. So a lot of journals are starting to get a little bit more lax. They're starting to recognize that maybe this is something that can be dealt with later. Maybe a copy editor or typesetter can do a lot of the formatting for you as long as the information's all there. Some journals are sticklers about this, though. So just be mindful of this. I encourage people, and I'll mention this again later, to look at instructions for authors to get a sense of whether they're dealing with one of those strict journals.